Hello everyone, welcome to the webcast on API innovation with a consumer mindset. First things first, just wanted to thank everyone kind of taking time out of your day to kind of join me to talk about this topic. So just to kind of kick things off, a brief introduction to myself. My name is Warren Choi. I'm a global digital advisor with Apigee. More specifically, I work with our customer success team. So I've been with Apigee for, almost 7 years now. During that entire time, really working a lot with our customers, kind of getting API programs started from the ground up, really working with C-level executives, VPs, directors on business strategy, and even just, from a delivery aspect of getting API programs kind of started from scratch. And so this topic in particular is something that is near and dear to my heart. Super happy to kind of spend some time to talk about it with you guys today. All right, in terms of topics of kind of what we wanted to cover, you might have seen this in the agenda as well as part of the description for this webcast, but we really wanted to go over different aspects of what it means when it comes to a user or a consumer-centric approach to API design and API innovation. So more specifically, we wanted to kind of revisit the digital value chain. This might be something that you might be familiar with, so I promise I will only spend just a few minutes kind of revisiting what the digital value chain is, and more specifically what it means in terms of the API consumer. We're going to be talking about the outside-in approach and why it's better. Dive a little bit into developer engagement, best practices to promote API adoption, examples of what we see in the industry. So this is kind of pertaining to what I was mentioning before of the experience that we've had working with the various customers over the years of kind of how they've approached it and some common trends that we've seen. And also just how to get started from your perspective. If you kind of want to go down this journey, what are some of the questions and things to consider that you need to think of as you kind of move into this approach. And then last but not least, we'll spend a little bit of time covering any questions that you guys may have. And to the best of my ability, I will answer them. So to get started, and I mentioned this, when we were talking about the topics as well. So the digital value chain is something that Apigee has been pitching for pretty much my entire time that I've been here with the company. It is sort of the bread and butter way of how we explain, the API journey or how APIs relate to the end-to-end kind of life cycle or all the different systems that are kind of involved when it comes to APIs. So if you've seen this before, I apologize in advance. I'm going to go over it just really, really quickly. But if you haven't, I will give you kind of a brief overview because this is really the foundation of the subsequent conversations we'll be having, specifically around this whole concept of a API consumer-centric approach to APIs. So I'm going to be starting over from the left and slowly moving over to the right. So at the leftmost bit, you have your consumer. So this is the end user, right? These are the people using the applications that are going to be powered by your APIs. So a good way of thinking about this, if you look at it from like mobile apps perspective, this is you and me. These are people with our iPhones or Pixel phones. We're using applications or mobile applications, and those applications are essentially powered by API. So that's us. That customer here is referring to the end user. When it comes to apps and experiences, that's what I was just mentioning before. That is the application itself. That is the thing on your phone where you go and if you want to use bank payments, the weather app, the news app, whatever it is. That is the application that we use. And that application is powered by APIs. Now, who develops those APIs is the developer, which is the third item that you see here on this list. That application was built by a developer, and that developer powers their application based off of APIs, or in this case, it's called the API product, which we'll get a little bit into more details later on in this webcast. And that's really, when we talk about APIs, that's kind of the core aspect that we're talking about from that perspective. Those APIs are built by an API team. Now we're getting a little bit into the developers potentially in your organization, right? If you have an API program, these are the people building the APIs for those developers to build the apps for the end consumer. So you're kind of starting to see what we mean here when we say the digital value chain, right? They're all kind of connected and all kind of related in that sense. And then of course, APIs themselves, they got to get the data from somewhere, right? And so that's where, we consider this the back end. So this could be things like databases or your back end services, things that you may want to expose out to the developers, or having that data, that capability exposed out to your developer, but packaged up in an API. So, just to kind of reiterate, customer, end user uses the application, like in this case, for my example, like a mobile application. Those applications are built by the developer. Those developers are using APIs. In this case, this is when it starts to come into kind of, your realm. Start using your APIs to power the applications that they're building. Those APIs are built by an API team. And then those APIs and the API team really are building APIs around some sort of backend system or backend service that you may have in place already. So in the topic of this webcast, we're really going to be focusing on what we call the consumer of the APIs. So you may have guessed it already, when we're talking about the consumer, we're really talking about the developer level that you kind of see here. Now, when we talk about API consumer, that can be, you can kind of break that up into different subcategories, right? In the context of developers, they could be external developers. So this could be a person working out of their garage and they're building some revolutionary new application. They have nothing really to do with your organization. They're not even really considered a partner of your organization, but they may actually use your APIs, if your APIs are open to the public, to build some sort of functionality for some application that they want to roll out to the end user. These can also be partner developers, so people that are external to your organization, but maybe like a partner company that you may work with to build some sort of application that, a joint application that you guys want to roll out to provide some value to your customers. They can also even be internal developers. They're not really listed here on the sheet, but even internally, the way that you can also look at it as well is that you may have an API program or a team that builds APIs, but your consumer is another part of your organization building some sort of internal application to roll out to, whether internally or even externally, to your end consumers as well. So as you can see here, when we talk about the API consumer, we really are talking about the consumers of the API, but those consumers can be, different people, both within and outside of your organization. So when we talk about this whole concept of a consumer approach, these are kind of things where you want to ask yourself, if you have an API program established already, have you heard of any of this feedback before, right? Things like, the API documentation isn't documented very well, or I'm having trouble finding the APIs that are pertaining to the application I want to build, or the API just doesn't do what I want it to, right? Or, I just cannot figure out how an API works. When we talk about user-centric approach to API design and API innovation, this is really what we want to focus on, right? We want to start addressing the fact that what we see as API programs that are successful really do take a consumer-centric or user-centric approach to how they design, how they implement, how they roll out their APIs. So if you're hearing a lot of these kind of feedback within your own API program, then this webcast you're kind of the target audience of who we want to talk to, specifically in the topics that we're going to be covering later on. So one of the reasons, or how we kind of explain, why you may be getting the feedback that we just talked about, is this whole concept of inside out and outside in approach to APIs. So once again, I'm going to revisit the digital value chain in this case. So when we talk about inside out, this is when we start talking about, think of it in terms of how you design an API. Traditionally, if you kind of look at, what I call like kind of the old school model of API design, when you start talking about API design from a legacy perspective, a lot of times what we see is that a lot of our customers start off with a inside-out approach. And so what I mean by that is they have some back-end service or some data they think is going to be useful. And really when they start building APIs, they're not really taking the customer or the app developer, in this case, the external consumer into account. They're really just saying, I have all this data, I have all this goodness in terms of backend services. How do I just wrap that into an API and then just sort of roll that out there for the masses to consume, right? It's sort of this whole build it and they will come kind of approach to API design. And what we see happen is they really just kind of repackage what the backend service provides and just kind of throw it out there. Now, the problem with this is that a lot of times, the backend services are complex. They're not necessarily straightforward or self-explanatory when it comes to understanding what it does, even from a data perspective. And so if I'm a person within the organization, it may make perfect sense. But if I'm that guy who's building the application in my garage and I have no idea how your backend services work, you can kind of see a scenario here where that becomes a little bit of an issue, right? If I'm just getting an API that's sort of like a data dump of all these different fields and data, I may have a hard time understanding, what exactly I need to extract to get my needs as an app developer out of that. And so that's sort of this whole inside out concept, right? Now, what we promote is sort of the opposite of that. This is the outside in approach. If you guys are familiar with this whole thing of API first method of API design, then this is sort of kind of related to that. And really what we mean by that is when you're designing your APIs or you're kind of approaching your API program, you kind of want to think of it from the other way around, right? The opposite of inside out, which is outside in, obviously. And what we mean by that is you really want to start thinking and putting yourself in the shoes of the end user and the application developer. So a simple way of thinking about it was, put yourself in the shoes of the application developer. If I was the person building the app, what sort of APIs would I want to consume, right? If I were to want the most easy, self-explanatory API to consume, what would that look like? And really kind of taking that mindset of saying, what are the needs of the end user? What kind of applications and data are they looking for? And also, what do the application developers want in terms of how to consume those APIs? And that may or may not correlate to the back end. So I think this is where, it gets a little bit tricky, because a lot of times, especially if you're internal within your organization and you have a good understanding of what the backend services provide, you tend to kind of want to go for building out APIs that the backend service can accommodate. Once again, I mentioned API first, where it becomes a little bit difficult for some of these teams and some of these programs is that they have a hard time decoupling from that model. And so they may approach outside in with best intentions, but they always kind of get into a position where it's really just sort of a slightly better version of the inside out model. What we want to promote is really just kind of starting from a blank slate and using that as the starting point, right? I mean, to some extent, just forgetting all about your backend services and saying purely from an application perspective, what are some cool apps? What are some cool functionalities that we think will be needed? And then using that as the jumping off point for your API design. So once again, to emphasize that I was talking about before, your API consumers are important, right? And some of the things to consider here is you really want to know who your app developers are and the applications that they're building. I already talked the inside out or an outside into death, but once again, correlating with this whole API first mentality, the API first approach to API design. Easy to consume APIs. I'm going to mention this a little bit later in the webcast, but things about like really taking a hard look at your APIs and are they really easy to understand? If I were to just kind of go in and look at those APIs, is it self-explanatory enough? Do the field names make sense on their own, right? Do I need to read some sort of long, API description document just to understand what payload I'm receiving when I'm making a call, and vice versa? You want to make the onboarding process simple and frictionless. This is something when I talk about developer portal later on, I'll cover in greater detail. But you want to make sure that getting access to your APIs is going to be a very smooth and not a very convoluted process. And then finally, build your requirements to your consumers, right? Not based off of your own requirements, right? Really, this is kind of putting yourself in the shoes of the app developer and the end user and building requirements from that perspective rather than just these are what services we have. What are the requirements of just packaging it up and getting it out there? So we're going to touch a little bit upon developer engagement. This is all sort of related to this ongoing stressing the importance of the API consumer approach. So of course the developer engagement is key to the success of your API program. What does that require? So these are the three main pillars that we see often in the industry, and this is something that we promote heavily with our customers. First of all is this concept of API products. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail of what an API product is. There's a lot of documentation and videos, and it's kind of one of the core foundations of Apigee as a product is the ability of bundling up your APIs into products. But very high level 10,000 foot description of what API products are is they're essentially a bundle of APIs. One way you can look at it, I like to use sort of the Lego analogy, right? If you guys are building out Legos, very rarely do you go and buy Lego pieces one by one when you're creating something. More often than not, you go into a store and you buy a set, and that set comes with all the pieces you need to build whatever, plane or boat or whatever you want to build. So you can think of API products as that set, right? It is a bundle of APIs. In this case, it will be the individual Lego pieces. But at the end of the day, it's a bundle of APIs to have some sort of, core functionality that you are providing to your application developers and your consumers. So having a great API product methodology and rollout model is key here. The other bit is a developer portal. Having some sort of mechanism of communicating out APIs, allowing the developers to have a place to go and register to get access to your API, as well as getting documentation and all those kind of cool things through some sort of a easy to use self-explanatory portal is another trend we see as being very important. And then also when it comes to developer enablement, right, providing them with the resources that they need and the support that they need to be successful in utilizing your APIs. So when it comes to best practices to promote adoption, we kind of have these four main categories. I'm going to deep dive into each one of these in just a little bit, but those are acquisition, documentation and onboarding, self-service, and of course the support and ongoing maintenance of your API consumers. So when we talk about acquisition, these are kind of the things that we talk about, right? This is sort of how do we get your app developers kind of onboarded and how do we get them, using your APIs and getting excited to use your APIs. So the first one is a concept you may have heard about. It's called the 5-5-5 rule. Long story short, within the first 5 seconds, you kind of want to grab their attention. In the next 5 seconds, you want to build interest. And then in the next 5 minutes, being able and empowering them to build an actual case of using your APIs. So once again, this is really kind of emphasizing getting them excited about your APIs and getting them able to quickly understand your API programs, what is it trying to accomplish, and really kind of building out a use case for those APIs in a very, very short amount of time. That relates to kind of some of the other bullet points you see here, such as value proposition, the ability to, how do you showcase your APIs, right? How do you kind of go out and promote these APIs and say, hey, this is something you guys want to use when you're building out your applications. Once again, the API market is very, very competitive. If you kind of really think about it, there are a lot of different APIs out there. Potentially you may have competitors that have their own API programs. And if you're really trying to win over an external application developer, for example, having the most simple to use, robust API catalog is really one way you're going to win them over, right? If I was once again, I keep going back to this example of the app developer that's working out of their garage. If they're building out the next revolutionary app and they're using your APIs, but they have a lot of different choices amongst you and your competitors of which APIs they want to utilize to get the data that they need, of course, they're going to be leaning more towards the APIs that are easier to consume rather than ones that are more complicated and a little bit more confusing, right? I mean, they're all about rolling applications out very quickly, and you really want to kind of appeal to that aspect of it. Which kind of goes into that fourth bullet point here about making easy to get started, making it frictionless. And then the last one is really just something that we've seen a lot as well. Promoting hackathons. This is something that we as Google we do a lot. As you may have heard. But really just having different mechanisms of really getting people to kind of have hands-on experiences with the APIs in order to acquire them as consumers for those APIs. These are kind of the key tenets that we talk about. The next one is documentation and onboarding. We're getting a little bit into developer portal now, but really what we're talking about here, first off, how do we engage developers before registration? This touches a little bit upon the concept of, a lot of times when it gets access to APIs, they're kind of locked behind this whole registration wall, where if I want to even look into the APIs that are available within a person's organization, I need to kind of go through this whole 5 to 10 step process of getting some, registered, getting an API key just to get access to play around with it. And we want to, however it makes sense, given your business case, kind of eliminate that model, right? You want to start promoting these APIs out there to the public so that, they can get a good understanding of the value that or the services that you're providing without kind of jumping through hoops to kind of getting access. Doesn't mean necessarily that you're opening up access to all your APIs to just anyone in the public. Once again, this really does depend on your business case and kind of what services you're providing. But the more you can get into this model of kind of providing open documentation or descriptions of what services you can provide, the easier it's going to be and the faster it's going to be for those app developers to really want to start onboarding with your API program. When they do eventually register, you want to make sure that registration process is frictionless as well. So this really kind of goes into the whole concept, once again, of thinking of when it comes to, we were talking about API design in the concept of API first, or from the perspective of an application developer. This is the same thing, just from a registration point of view, right? Your registration process should be thought of if I was an application developer, what sort of registration process would I want to go through? I guarantee you that everyone wants a simpler registration process rather than a very complicated one that takes, a week to get an API key. They want something quick, they want something fast, and they want something that's very straightforward and easy to onboard with. Self-service. So once again, I touched a little bit upon this when I was describing about API design early on. But you want to make sure your APIs are easy to understand. We talk a little bit about API products here as well. You want to make sure that you are, when it comes to creating an application or having them playing around with your APIs, you want it to be as self-explanatory as you can possibly be. And what I mean, and that goes, that can be looked at from a variety of different ways, right? You can look at it from how these API request and response payloads look like. How simple are they, or how big the payloads are. How granular the APIs are, for example. That's another way of doing it. But really, it's the concept of like, if I'm building my initial application and I just wanted to quickly play around with your APIs, what's the quickest, most effective way of doing that? And self-service, self-explanatory kind of APIs is definitely the model we recommend. Is definitely the way to go. And the API programs that we see our customers have the most success, those APIs are very easy to understand. Just kind of reading a 1 to 2 sentence description, or even to some extent the API name itself, just reading it will, if they can read it and get a good understanding of, I know what this API does, then the easier the better. And then there's also this whole concept of having them try this out. This ties once again with the whole registration process, but also within a capability of Apigee as a product of being able to call APIs or doing test calls through the portal itself is something that we see a lot of success with. So if you can implement something like that and provide them with some sort of try it now feature within your developer portal, that is kind of the ideal method that we recommend when it comes to the ease of onboarding and the time to get folks onboarded onto your API program. And last but not least, support and maintenance. This is sort of the ongoing support once they are kind of building applications using your APIs. What resources do they have in case they run into roadblocks, right? What kind of documentation, what kind of guides do they need to follow? What sort of write-up? Community. We talk about this whole concept of you building out an API community where you may have something like a forum or a blog or some sort of mechanism where they can go in and ask questions about like, hey, I'm running into this issue with consuming an API. How do I get around it? Or I'm getting a weird response. Can someone please explain to me what this response is? And really, it's once again, it's kind of providing them with the resources that they need to be successful in using and consuming your APIs. And this could be within your developer portal as well. It could be part of maybe dedicated role that you have, like an API evangelist or some sort of product owner. But the other way of looking at this too is really just having a mechanism of capturing feedback, right? Once your APIs are rolled out, it doesn't mean those APIs will forever not be changed, right? We have versioning. We want you to build out your APIs in iterations and constantly get feedback from your API consumers and app developers so that you can further iterate and enhance those APIs to cater to the needs of where your business is going and specifically who's consuming those APIs. So here's some examples that we've seen in the industry. I personally have seen a lot of this with a lot of our customers kind of over the years when they're talking about, taking this whole outside-in approach, ease of use, ease of onboarding. These are some common trends. I'm not going to go into the details of kind of each one of these because that's going to be different webcasts and different topics all on its own. But I do recommend that if any one of these are of interest to you, definitely kind of hit up either our Apigee community or Apigee docs page. We have a lot of good documentation on our website that really deep dive into a lot of these different things, whether they be kind of industry standards and industry trends or very specific product capabilities that can kind of help you out with this. So one of the trends that we see is moving to RESTful APIs, right? A lot of our customers, specifically those with API programs that have been around for a while, they usually come from a kind of a SOAP-based API model. Those with things like XML payloads, for example, and having that move over to something more RESTful, something using JSON as from a payload perspective. That's sort of one of the common first steps we see, where just making the payload easier to read, right? Easier to use from a consumer perspective. Kind of with that as well, what we see a lot when it comes to RESTful APIs and kind of specifically in the concept of payloads is that a lot of times when we see with legacy APIs that sometimes these payloads are huge. They're giving them basically like all the data within a specific call, and just to kind of comb through all of that to get maybe a specific field that the app developer needs is sort of a kind of a tedious thing. Using something like the Apigee API platform to customize or to adjust the payload, based on maybe some sort of entry criteria or some sort of data that they're passing in as part of the API request. Is things that they can use to kind of really either maybe shorten or filter out certain fields pertaining to what the app developer wants to use. So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. But just keep in mind that, once again, this whole concept of you want your APIs that are self-explanatory, but also easy to consume, easy to read, and easy to understand. I talked about incorporating methods of feedback. Once again, blogs, forums, having a dedicated role to kind of go in and, ping your application developers and saying, hey, what's working, what's not. That is another way of really allowing you to better steer your API program in the direction of consumability and having this whole consumer kind of approach to APIs, so that when you're investing your time and resources of building that next version of the API, you don't want to kind of just shoot in the dark. You really want to base it off some hard data, some hard feedback, both positive and negative, that you're getting from the people actually using your APIs. We talked about developer portal, already, but once again, utilizing it in a very effective manner. When it comes to the registration process, when it comes to documentation, when it comes to this whole try it now feature with APIs, things like that. This one's an interesting one. The whole role of an API evangelist. A lot of times we don't see this role when, especially with our newer customers, right? This is sort of a new role that only kind of a select handful of our customers kind of have pre-established before really rethinking their API program. And what we mean about API evangelist is sort of like the person who promotes the API. So this could be someone who goes out and maybe hosts the hackathons, or really reaches out to your application community and saying, hey, look, these are all the cool new APIs that are being developed. This is why you want to use these APIs. And really someone to kind of promote those APIs is kind of the purpose of this role. And a lot of times this role is also combined with a person who's the direct person getting the feedback. When we talk about the feedback, the second bullet point here, that's also kind of related to that role as well. Simplifying the API registration process. Once again, we talked about that already, but you want it to be as simple as possible. You don't want it to be a 1 week, 2 week process of running through manual approvals and sending emails just to get an API key. If you can make this self-service through a thing like a developer portal, make it, within seconds to get an API key rather than, a very manual process that takes time, the faster the better and the easier the better. And then once again, this move to API products, once again, it just kind of makes understanding the APIs easier if you were to kind of take a whole product or a productization or a product-centric approach to it. Because once again, going back to the Lego analogy, it's a little bit easier to understand when it's sort of bundled in the context of a specific functionality or a specific group, so that people can say, oh yeah, that's the API product I want to use because that is the one closest tied to the application I want to build. All right, so let's say you want to start getting started. Let's say that kind of going all the way back to one of the earlier slides, you are getting a lot of this feedback that your API program has APIs that are hard to use, or just people just having a hard time understanding how your APIs work, or it's a very high touch kind of model where you need to constantly work with your app developers just to kind of get them onboarded and have them start consuming your APIs and understanding your APIs. These are the common questions that we ask our customers, and you would probably want to start asking yourself, and really kind of taking a hard look at your API program and really kind of saying, okay, how do we start down this path of getting to that model that we want to get to, this whole outside-in model. One is identifying, who are my API consumers and what applications are they building. Once again, this is really having a good understanding of who's actually consuming your APIs is definitely the first start. If you have no idea who's using your APIs, that is a problem. And so you want to start addressing, really understanding who's consuming your APIs, how they're consuming it, and what kind of feedback that they have. The other one is, how self-explanatory are the APIs? How easy are they to understand? We talked about whole RESTful earlier on as well, right? When it comes to payloads, when it comes to API naming conventions, is it straightforward enough? If I had no idea what the backend systems did, would I still be able to kind of piece together what an API could do based specifically just on the name alone? Things like that. Do I have a developer portal ready to support my community? Once again, developer portal is just a tool, a mechanism to interact with your application developers. So we highly recommend you utilize something like that. We've seen a lot of success in having a developer portal be that mechanism, be that tool for your developers. What does your developer onboarding process look like? Once again, make it simple, make it automated if it makes sense for your business. The most common example we see here for a developer onboarding process is very much like how when you register for, like an online store, right? Provide me with your email, maybe some basic information. I will shoot you an automated email confirmation. Just to confirm it's a real email address. And once that's done, bam, the registration process is done. You can log in and start reading documentation and potentially even making some API calls. If you can get to that kind of model, that's, a really good model to kind of get to, just because it's very easy, it's very quick. Within a matter of, seconds, really, I can start reading up on API documentation and getting access to start playing around with your APIs. That kind of ties a little bit into the fifth point here, which is how quickly can developers obtain an API key as well. Where will developers get answers when they encounter issues? So this is the whole support, ongoing support and maintenance that we talked about earlier. And then finally, what KPIs will I track to kind of determine the what success looks like? So this is more of a kind of an internal thing, but just to kind of touch a little bit about KPIs. And once again, there's a lot of good documentation on KPIs that are out there on our Apigee website, so I encourage you to look there. But when we talk about KPIs here, we're talking about things like, the number of active developers, right? Not the number of developers, the number of active developers who are consistently using your APIs. The number of useful APIs. A lot of times we see our customers think if they have 900 APIs, that shows a successful API program. We disagree. We think it's not about the number of APIs, but it's about, do you have a core set of APIs that can pertain to a lot of different API products, a lot of different applications that can be easily reused for a lot of various business cases and use cases and things like that. That is more useful than just the sheer number of APIs. And then also, of course, the speed of onboarding, traffic growth, direct revenue. There's a lot of different ways of kind of measuring the KPIs, but that's kind of one thing you want to keep in mind is what are the KPIs for your API program, and how does that tie back into the this whole concept of a user-centric approach. So once again, I mean, these are just kind of questions to consider that you want to ask yourself. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach it, but as long as you can approach it once again from this outside-in model, that is something that we, the purpose of this webcast is really kind of to stress that, in particular. So, all right, so that is just sort of the high-level overview of what we wanted to talk about when it comes to this whole kind of user-centric application, consumer-centric approach to APIs. Once again, I've only touched upon it at a very, very high level. I mean, I hope what you've taken away from this is sort of how we think of a outside in type approach. What are some of the key things that we think are very, very important. We've only really touched a little bit at a very high level kind of what our other customers have done, but you can hopefully see the common trends of at least the approach that they took when it comes to things like RESTful API design, when it comes to things like utilizing developer portal, and just even in terms of the mentality and how they kind of switch when it comes to API design. Shifting the mentality from an outside-in model to from an inside-out model to an outside-in model. So with that, I can kind of see that we already have a couple of questions already. So I'm going to do my best to get through all of them. If I don't get a chance to get through all the questions, I definitely will answer them either offline, either after this session is done, or kind of within the chat itself. So if I don't get to your question, I do apologize in advance, but I will get to as many of these as I can. All right, first question that I can see here. Can you elaborate on the RESTful approach and how it ties to the whole outside-in model? Yeah, so RESTful approach, what I was talking about, in the middle of this webcast is this whole concept of, how self-explanatory are the APIs. So if you those of you who are not familiar, I mean, the whole concept of a RESTful approach is really things like, they have a certain way of doing like naming conventions and things like that. And really, that's kind of what we wanted to emphasize, right? From an API, I'll start with naming convention. Are the APIs named in such a way where I can very easily understand what the API can do? So this whole concept of, like the whole post and put and delete and the verbs and all that. I mean, really the whole RESTful approach is really to get to that model where there is a kind of a universal common understanding of what an API can do, just kind of based off the name alone. So that's kind of what I mean by, ease of use for the API kind of following a RESTful approach. All right, other question. What do you mean when you talk about API products? So just to kind of reiterate, when I talk about API products, once again, this is about the bundling of the APIs, using that whole Lego analogy that I kind of talked about earlier. API products, and I mentioned this before, it is really a core part of how Apigee as a platform is built. We lean heavily into this whole concept of API products because the way that we see it is that if you can, there's one thing to have an API catalog, but API products is just another mechanism of, if you take a productization approach or a way of thinking of your APIs, then really you're starting to think about packaging those APIs to maybe one day get even to a monetization type model where you're charging your consumers per API call. And really the concept behind that is, you want to start thinking of APIs as, I have a lot of useful data. There are people internal, external within our company that wants to have access to that data because they can use that data in a lot of cool ways with their applications. How do I expose that data out in APIs? And if you can think about it from a product model, like as if you're trying to sell those APIs and there's some sort of like monetary return you're going to get for those APIs, that really is putting you in the right mindset of how you want to think about when you're exposing out your APIs, right? If you're thinking from that perspective of I have useful data, but how do I roll it out in such a way where people will want to pay money to use that, then that's definitely kind of the first step into a model that you want to get into that kind of leads to a successful API program. So long story short, that's what we talk about API products. Once again, how it correlates is you are thinking in terms of, as an app developer, I really want to get access to that cool data that you have in your back end. How would I want to make those calls as an app developer? Putting yourself in their shoes. Next question, when it comes to the developer portal, should I start off big or can it be iterated over time? Great question. Personally, what I've seen is the iteration approach, and that is sort of the approach that I would recommend. You're not going to get your developer portal perfect, and this goes the same with APIs themselves as well. You're not going to get it right on the first try, right? There's going to be feedback that you're going to get. And what you want to avoid, probably most importantly, is you don't want to spend so much time trying to create the perfect developer portal with the perfect registration process that you elongate kind of your time to market. You want to roll something out there very quick. It may not have all the bells and whistles. For example, like developer portal, it may not have a blog or a forum capability to get right from the start. But you want to roll it out with your APIs, and you want to roll them out quickly because you want to start gathering that feedback as quickly as possible. So in this case, I definitely would recommend that as long as you kind of get in my opinion, as long as you can kind of get a very easy to use kind of registration process, maybe some look and feel tweaks, and some good documentation up and running. Start with the basics, start from there, and kind of iterate over time is definitely the way that I would go. One thing that ideally you would want to avoid is kind of rolling out the APIs in some sort of mechanism. God forbid it being some sort of like 300-page API document or something like that you have to email over to all your app developers. More quickly you can roll out a developer portal, the better in my mind. But that was a great question. All right, let's see. You mentioned capturing feedback from consumers. What are some examples of how that can be done? Once again, another great question. I'm going to go back to developer portal here. A lot of times when it comes to feedback, it could be done through forms. If you have this idea of implementing a form, that could be one mechanism. On the developer portal itself, there could be a feedback link. We talked about the role of the API evangelist, or maybe a product owner, or someone who can maybe proactively reach out to application developers and kind of get feedback there. The importance here is not only do you want to capture feedback, and there's a lot of different ways as I just described of doing that, but you want to make sure that there is a process that you build into your API program and your software delivery lifecycle of how do we take that feedback and incorporate it into the next iteration of the API. I think that's the trick here. I think there's a lot of times when people go down this approach, they think about how to capture the feedback, but they don't really think about how to act upon it, right? So when you're starting to think about things like, for example, we promote like an agile type, methodology when it comes to API development. The reason we promote that is because, with something like agile or an iterative approach to development, you can very quickly kind of turn on a dime and implement, new feature requests or, new feedback you're getting, much more quickly than if you were to do something like in a waterfall type delivery model. So it's sort of all related to that. You just want to make sure that there's a good mechanism of getting that feedback back to your product owners and your API developers, just so that they can act upon it. That's another great question as well. So given the amount of time we have left, this is probably the last question I'll answer live, and then we will kind of maybe jump into answering the rest of the questions via chat. Let's see, is the developer portal for external users only? Okay, that's a great question. In my mind, and this is what I tell my customers as well, your developer portal should not differentiate between internal and external. And what I mean by that is, and this kind of goes into the whole philosophy of your API design as well. You don't want to design an API for, these APIs are for external consumers, and I'm going to design my internal APIs differently. From the end of the day, you want to look at your API consumers as sort of one entity. Because at the end of the day, everyone, whether they be internal or external application developers within your organization, wants APIs that are easy to use. They want to get access to those APIs in a quick and efficient manner. So you should always approach it and always try to strive to make your APIs as easy to consume as possible, regardless of if they are, an external partner, a person working, building an application in their garage, or the person just sitting on the opposite side of the building. Right? You have much more flexibility, of course, if there are internal applications, because maybe those application developers already understand the backend services and what that pertains, but you don't want to go down the path of building kind of two different versions of the same API, one for internal, one for external, if you have the option of building one API that both parties can use. From a maintainability, it's a lot easier, but also just in terms of happy app developers, once again, putting yourself in the shoes of what can I do to make their lives a lot easier so that they can go build their applications much quicker. That is sort of the approach you want to take. So developer portal falls in that same line as well, to kind of directly answer your question. When you're building out a developer portal, a lot of times we tell our customers that they should build one developer portal. Now, what the person can see in that developer portal in terms of like what APIs are available to them, that's where something like role-based access control will come in. As an external person using the developer portal, I may not see all of the APIs that an internal user would see, but it should still be one portal. Ideally, you won't want to get into a scenario where you have to maintain and upkeep two separate developer portals just from a cost and operations perspective. All right, so with that, I think that is a wrap for the webcast. So once again, thank you so much for kind of spending the time today with me to kind of go over this topic. Once again, it's something that we see a lot with our customers. It's sort of the ongoing message that we promote a lot with our customer base. So I really hope that you found this useful. I hope that there is some of the questions we brought up, some of the topics that we talked about will get you kind of thinking about where you're at with your API program, and more importantly, kind of how do you want to get to that ideal state of having this whole user-centric approach to your APIs. And once again, if there are any questions you have, definitely reach out. We have a very robust kind of community to kind of answer your questions. Once again, I mentioned before, we have a very great and robust documentation site for Apigee that not only goes through all the Apigee capabilities, but also even concepts like RESTful API design, versioning, and all these different things, developer portal, for example. So I highly recommend you guys take a look at that if that interests you. So that's a wrap on the webcast. Once again, thanks again, and hope you guys have a great day.